Sadly, Middlesbrough Football Club are irrelevant now. Sadly, because once upon a time, they were one of the most exciting teams in English football. The decade that was, for one reason or another, called the Noughties, was home to lots of quirks in football. The rise of billionaire owners, new winter footballs, the advent of the Barclays. Many teams flourished in this space: Sam Allardyce and his Bolton Wanderers team, Alan Curbishley's Charlton Athletic, and Tony Pulis' Stoke City, to name just a few. None, though, captured the imagination quite like Middlesbrough in what can comfortably be called the club's golden age. It took in a trophy, a Premier League record, and a European final. In today's film, we discuss the greatest comeback since Lazarus. Middlesbrough's story from Cardiff to Eindhoven in the 2000s. Where were we? Oh yes, Borough were back in the big time and the millennium was just around the corner. The first season was back in the 1998-99 campaign, and experience was clearly the aim of Brian Robson. Added to the names of Paul Merson, Paul Gascoigne and Andy Townsend were the defensive stalwarts of Colin Cooper and Gary Pallister. By December, Borough had beaten the eventual treble winners Manchester United on their own turf and occupied a Champions League place. Borough fans could be sarcastically heard chanting that they were going to win the league. Of course, this would never hold up, but a 9th place finish constituted a Borough record in the Premier League era. Ultimately, that proved the peak of Brian Robson at the Riverside. By 2001, Borough were back in the dogfights that had been so often their preserve in the top flight, and Steve Gibson made the surprisingly tone-deaf appointment of Terry Venables to quote-unquote co-manage the team alongside Robson. The marriage was one made in pure hell, as both men jostled for position, neither truly delivering what was best for the club. Ultimately, it sparked the beginning of the end for Robson, and in turn it paved the way for another Manchester United figure to succeed him. Steve McClaren was the assistant manager who had presided over one of the greatest league dominances in the nation's footballing history, as United eloped to 3 successive league titles. McClaren cut his teeth at Derby County as one of a new age of football coaching nerds, convincing Jim Smith to adopt Prozone to the club's benefit. He made a similar bet with Alex Ferguson at Old Trafford to implement the software if the Red Devils could win the Champions League. Within 4 months, they had of course done so, helping to modernise the best club in the land even further. McClaren was now ready to make the leap to the big seat. Expectations were properly in the toilet for McClaren, but the man improved the club's place in the division. He reached an FA Cup semi-final, fully ingratiating himself fully to the Borough cause by bringing back Juninho for an incredible 3rd stint. Whilst the little fella clearly wasn't the player he had been in the mid-90s, he was head and shoulders above anything the Riverside had seen since the last time that he had played there. Holding the increasingly prominent role of head coach, McClaren's number 2 and effective assistant manager was renowned sports psychologist Bill Bezic, who was employed more so as an advisor and would become important much later on. Whilst Brian Robson had the name value and was keen to recruit players of similar star quality, McClaren was viewed as a cheaper, more technical alternative. The club raised its professionalism significantly, something you'll remember from last week where Fabrizio Ravanelli shunned the club for. As the club remained on a level footing of being aggressively mid-table, almost offensively so, McClaren was busier weeding out the dirt and planting his own vision for the club. The big names of Christian Carambeau, Paul Ince and Brian Deane were all shipped out under his watch, whilst the influential Alan Boxic was sold without much hesitation. In came characters fit for the team. Gareth Southgate was a player that McClaren labelled his greatest signing whilst at the Riverside. Meanwhile, Frank Quedrew was more of an unknown quantity but would become revered in the North East. Up front there was Massimo Macaroni, in the middle was the indomitable George Boateng alongside figures such as Ugo Ekiog and Juninho. Middlesbrough had a real team once again. All they needed now was a platform, and the Brian Robson hangover left fans with a dry mouth that desperately craved a trophy. Like a bag of Haribo Tanfastics, the season began sourly. Middlesbrough tasted the bitterness of the relegation zone after 4 losses from the first 5 matches. Whilst this run encapsulated the eventually invincible Arsenal and dark horse Bolton Wanderers, who reached a cup final, more on them later, it also did take in the eventually relegated outfits of Leicester City and Leeds United. Whatever way you spun it, it was a bad start. McLaren had opted for quality over quantity, and immeasurable experience was added to the Borough lineup with his 3 senior signings in the summer. Danny Mills was acquired as a right-back on a season-long loan from Leeds, albeit a permanent move was expected to come at the end of the season. Gaisca Mendieta felt more like a Brian Robson-era acquisition, but alongside his star power, he would supply the Middlesbrough midfield with ample experience from his time playing at Barcelona, Valencia and Lazio, 3 of the biggest clubs on the continent at the time. Once one of the premier players in Europe, Mendieta would be joined by Chelsea's Bolo Zenden after his time at Chelsea broke down. Like Mendieta, Zenden had spent time at the Camp Nou, so he was used to highly pressurised scenarios. All in all, 3 players in and they could all boast Champions League quality. Hard work had been made of the opening stages of the Premier League season, and that too could be said of Middlesbrough's League Cup campaign. Extra time was needed against the lowly Brighton, whilst Gaisca Mendieta had to be summoned to defeat lower league Wigan Athletic. By the time Borough were fed Premier League opposition, they had to go the distance on multiple occasions, when Everton and Tottenham Hotspur were pulled out of the hat. Nonetheless, Borough dispatched of both from 12 yards and reached a second semi-final under Steve McLaren. Unfortunately, the good fortune of the semi-final draws that were kind to his predecessor in 1997 wasn't bestowed upon Steve McLaren. Instead of a third-tier opponent, Middlesbrough were granted the strongest team available, Arsenal. The Gunners were still undefeated in domestic competition and were huge favourites to lift the League Cup. Meanwhile, injuries were busy thwarting the Borough once again, both in defence and in attack. If Malcolm Christie was a horse, he'd have been turned into glue by now, as he would miss the entire calendar year known as 2004. Meanwhile, Ugo Ekiog and Chris Riggott were hopped on and off the treatment table, leaving Colin Cooper to deputise alongside club captain Gareth Southgate. Southgate remained the cornerstone of the team in this time, alongside newer recruits in Mills and Quadru, with the immovable Mark Schwarzer behind them in net. These foundations stood the test of time for a more conservative Middlesbrough. After the early blip that kick-started the Premier League season, Borough embarked on a 2-month unbeaten run. This allowed Borough to don the camouflage and assume their rightful place as one of the more forgettable teams in mid-table. Less forgettable, however, was their League Cup run. With the odds stacked against them, Borough travelled to North London in their thousands for the first leg of the semi-final at Highbury against the undefeatable Arsenal. Undefeatable until Juninho stole the only goal of the contest. The Gunners didn't enlist their full armoury for the first leg and neither too for the second leg, but their lineup ought to have been capable of overturning the deficit up at the Riverside. Again though, they came unstuck. Bolo Zenden with the opener to double the aggregate scoreline. Zenden had wildly underachieved during his short stint at the Riverside, but in big occasions, the Dutchman stepped up. An own goal from Jose Antonio Reyes sealed Borough's first final in 6 years, where they would meet Bolton. Bolton were a team attempting to perform the same miracles as Steve McLaren and Middlesbrough. They ran with the same lads, that being Everton, Villa, Blackburn and Charlton, as they all attempted to gatecrash what had seemingly become a closed shop of the top 4. With Newcastle United and Leeds United dropping out of the picture for the time being, it could be that the participants of the 2004 League Cup final could be jostling to take their place. Middlesbrough had one piece of magic up their sleeve, and it contained the type of story only told by the winners. McLaren's right-hand man Bill Bezic sat the team down before the final and showed off his Adobe Premiere Pro skills by splicing Al Pacino's legendary speech from Any Given Sunday on top of footage of the team from their run to the League Cup final. Pacino said life was a game of inches, and those inches were going Borough's way as 2 trademark free kicks from Bolton were flagged for the narrowest of offsides. This was all part of the plan, as McLaren had previously enlisted match referee Mike Riley to understand his interpretation of the offside law. With that knowledge in the bank, Borough could nullify one of Bolton's greatest threats. In his iconic speech, Pacino's character mutters, "That's football, guys," which, you can imagine, many a smartass recollecting when Bolo Zenden's illegal double-touch penalty went under the radar of referee Mike Riley. It was an early penalty that had built on the extraordinarily early opener from Joseph Desire's job, set up by Zenden and missed by McLaren. McLaren, being the Hare Island-style icon that he is, marched onto the Cardiff turf in his suit, collar and tie, with flower attached to his lapel. But he wanted to coach the players through the game in his comfies, so in changing into his tracksuit, missed the opening goal. Job snuck in on the back post to find that goal. The Cameroonian was up front in place of Massimo Maccarone, who was rendered broken by the decision. It would force him to depart on loans in his homeland of Serie A the following season. As it turned out, fate had a different plan for Maccarone. So too Mark Schwarzer, as his arms appeared to have the same constitution as Angel Delight when attempting to keep out a tame Kevin Davies effort. The Australian, however, would step up to thwart his opponents with a few world-class saves to award Middlesbrough their first trophy in 128 years. With that hurdle overcome and both relegation and a Champions League spot completely out of the question, Borough's season was effectively curtailed on February the 29th. The fizzling out of the season extended to a bookending of that season with 4 losses from the final 5, mirroring their start. It resulted in 11th place. That, combined with a trophy, pointed to a great success. The perfect time then to blood some of the youngsters that were coming through thanks to the work of Academy Director Dave Parnaby and the willingness of McLaren to promote from within. The wave of talent included the director's son Stuart Parnaby, who actually wasn't like the junior football manager's son you've all played with, i.e. shit, but he turned into a good professional. Elsewhere, the standouts were Stuart Downing and James Morrison, whilst Tony McMahon, Andrew Davies, Matthew Bates and Adam Johnson would all make their debuts in the next season or so. The youth team had reached the Youth Cup final in 2003, admittedly ahead of schedule against a more experienced Manchester United. Whilst they tasted defeat, they returned to the same match the following season and defeated an Aston Villa team that contained Gabriel Agbonlahor, Gary Cahill and Craig Gardner. The future was bright, the future wasn't orange, but the future, seemingly, was Borough. Until 2004 though, that future didn't appear to feature any goals. Finding the net had become an enormous problem, and since the departure of Alan Boksic, no Borough player had found double figures over the course of a full season. Hold your horses though. That former Lazio and Juventus player was hardly prolific, scoring 12 goals in the 2000-2001 season at the height of Boksic mania. The problem? Manyfold. Malcolm Christie was always injured. Joseph Desire Job and Zilad Nemeth were fine forwards but could never find the net with any regularity needed, and Massimo Maccarone was unfavoured but clearly had potential, so had been shipped out on loan back to Italy. With the club as blunt as a pack of cocktail sticks, in came Mark Verduca, who was 6 months removed from links to clubs like Manchester United. He suffered for his loyalty to the sinking ship called Leeds United, when the likes of Lee Bowyer, Jonathan Woodgate and Rio Ferdinand all profited from their defections. The Australian signing was lubricated by his relationship with international teammate Mark Schwarzer and former neighbour Ugo Ekiog, as well as the fact that he didn't actually have to move house. No laurels were being rested on at the Riverside, as they went to even greater lengths when a peak Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank pitched up in the northeast. His contract was terminated at Chelsea in the face of Jose Mourinho's arrival, and in acquiring the Dutchman, Borough had beaten Rangers, Besiktas, Celtic and Fulham to the punch. With that type of ambition in the pipeline, Bolo Zenden twigged that it was a great idea to join on a permanent basis after his loan. Even negatives transformed into positives when Danny Mills' permanent move was cancelled and the fullback signed for Manchester City. More on them boys later on. In his place came a right-back even more experienced when Michael Reiziger of Barcelona and the Netherlands fame turned up in his place, before finally an invincible turned up, Ray Parlour. Well stocked in every part of the pitch, Borough lent themselves to a shift in tactical style. With an overabundance of centre-forwards, Steve McClaren wanted to return to the 4-4-2, which spelled the end for one of the club's biggest legends. The Riverside had to come to terms with the end of the little fella. Juninho was now incompatible with the system and now remarkably in his third stint. A little bit slower against a new evolution of defender thanks to the losing battle against old Father Time, the sand would have escaped the timer soon enough anyway. As it turned out, the tactical shift only served to fast-track it. The more loyal, nostalgic and faithful amongst the Borough support wept that a place couldn't be found for Juninho in Borough's first European season. It remains a black mark on the club the way he was treated on the way out. Juninho was selected for a second team to play Carlisle United in a friendly, and it left him in no doubt as to his future. He was officially out in the cold, so he moved to Celtic without a proper send-off. With all that business in the back pocket, the aim was clear. Middlesbrough had to be the best of the rest. Stuart Downing was now a regular down the left of midfield. He was an excitable graduate of the youth team and was armed with experience after a loan to Sunderland. He'd built up a partnership with Frank Quedrew down the left. With a collection of multi-tooled forwards who could hold the ball up, run the channels or be penalty box poachers, Downing was well drilled by Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank, who made it abundantly clear how he wished to be fed his goals. We already knew how strong the defence had been, something that Steve McClaren got flack for. Whilst his brand of football was a million miles away from Robson's gung-ho stratagems, it had proved to have worked already. Borough opened the season up with a creditable draw against Newcastle before ending on a train that only passed through Dreamland before derailing the following week. 3-1 up against Arsenal, still invincible in the league, a patchwork Borough defence crumbled to defeat. Borough had gone toe-to-toe with two of the best teams in the country, and they had matched them. Hasselbank and Viduka combined for what should have been the start of a beautiful relationship at Craven Cottage in a second-half win over Fulham, before both men proved the difference in successive wins over Crystal Palace and Birmingham City. Unfortunately, this run was ended when Viduka was sidelined for much of the season by injury. After the September international break, Middlesbrough had their first European endeavour and they faced fitting opponents. Czech Republic's Baník Ostrava wasn't the first name Borough would have chosen out of the hat, on a reputational basis at least, and whilst they were still a capable opponent, they were fitting because of their background. Ostrava is known as the steel heart of the Czech Republic, and its industrial past as a coal mining and metallurgical hub close to the Polish border is bound to Middlesbrough's own history. So, Borough twatted them 3-0, rested a couple of players in the second leg, and officially progressed to a new group phase of the UEFA Cup. Progression to this phase helped shake the mini-hangover of consecutive defeats to Everton and Chelsea before embarking on a 7-match unbeaten league run which took in games against Manchester United and Liverpool. Steve McClaren was keen not to make this European endeavour a one-off, yet they were handed a group which featured a former European Cup finalist, a former Italian champion, an upcoming Spanish team and some team from Greece nobody had heard of. The UEFA Cup around this time was admittedly a half-arsed format. Borough would play 4 group games in a 5-team group and the top 3 would progress. The opponents were a Lazio team in a pickle, an improving Villarreal, Partizan Belgrade and Agalio. It all began with that sunny trip to Greece as Borough held 5th place in the league and all was right in the world, especially once Stuart Downing netted the decisive goal. Next, Lazio at home, i.e. one of Europe's giants. Giants slain when Bolo Zenden provided one of the Riverside's greatest nights. The Dutchman bagged himself a double and, tune your ears in because this actually happened, Middlesbrough beat Lazio. It was a night Gareth Southgate called the biggest in the club's history. The most difficult match, however, was next, away at Al Madrigal to Villarreal, as the soon-to-be Champions League semi-finalists swatted Borough aside. They wouldn't confirm their qualification until they returned to the competition on the final day, when a return to home comforts confirmed a 3-goal win over Partizan. After losses at Old Trafford and Anfield in the 4th round of the domestic cups, Middlesbrough were fully geared towards their European endeavours when the UEFA Cup returned in mid-February. When the trip to the incredibly named Arnold Schwarzenegger Stadium to face Grazer AK took place, Borough still held a top 6 spot in the palm of their hand. Therefore, they were in pole position to return to Europe for the following season. The league form had admittedly taken a dive in the new year, with just one victory up to April that had Borough eventually skirting dangerously close to falling out of Europe altogether. Once again, the medical room was working overtime to send players out onto the pitch. Guys Mendieta, Mark Viduka, Malcolm Christie and George Boateng were all missing in this time, while Stuart Parnaby, Chris Riggott and Ugo Ekiag all suffered from injury woes as 2005 began. Luckily, Borough's academy propped the club up throughout this time, but they couldn't be expected to juggle both domestic and European fronts. With players like James Morrison, Tony McMahon, Andrew Davis, Matthew Bates and Danny Graham all receiving significant minutes from such a young age, it's no wonder the busy schedule swallowed the team up. Whilst the win couldn't be achieved at the old Schwarzenegger, Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank was the difference, netting 2 of Borough's 4 goals in a 4-3 aggregate triumph. This fed them sporting in the last 16, with the Riverside home leg to be played first. The rousing Riverside crowd woke the Borough players from their slumber of a 3-goal deficit to bring some semblance of life back to the tie, with 2 late goals from Joseph Desiree Job and Chris Riggott. Unfortunately, the tie proved one too far for the Borough, as they couldn't manufacture a goal when 2 were needed in Lisbon. Attention instantly switched to the Premier League, and after a defeat to Southampton, Middlesbrough was staring at 8 games to salvage a European return. Anybody as low as Manchester City in 12th place could feasibly strong-arm their way into the European places, whilst the eventual European champions Liverpool were still catchable as they occupied 5th. The fight back started at Sellers Park via a Sol Fancredru goal, and whilst a home defeat at Arsenal was forgivable, Borough just about injected some life into their campaign with a last-gasp Bolo Zenden penalty the following week against Fulham. A 4-goal thrashing over a seemingly doomed West Bromwich Albion gave Borough some breathing room, but their final 4 fixtures were all against European rivals. First came the clean sheet at St James's Park, and Borough stayed 7th. Then another point on the road, this time at Anfield, and Borough crept down to 8th, out of Europe. But 2 games remained, and the prospect was tantalising. Spurs occupied that 7th and final European spot, level on 51 points with Borough, and they were the final visitors to the Riverside that season. Meanwhile, Manchester City were 3 points back on both of them, and a trip to Eastlands was Borough's last assignment of the season. Whatever the weather, Borough weren't going to do it the easy way, as per. Able to select an experienced side for the 6 pointers, George Boateng rewarded his manager by ripping an early finish into the net. It proved the only goal. Manchester City's early double salvo at Villa Park kept the heat on Borough. So we were due a showdown in Manchester for 7th spot. City's superior goal difference made the contest hotly anticipated. They needed a win, Borough could afford a draw and qualify. The game started perfectly as Hasselbank thunderfucked a 3 kick in to send the Borough fans into raptures. The second half onslaught was inevitable, especially after Kiki Musamba offered a rare beacon of light in his daft stint in Manchester with the equaliser. Middlesbrough had to make do with the counter-attack as Manchester City became so desperate for the winning goal that David James was sent up front when Nicky Weaver came on for an outfield player. A goalkeeper playing up front in a game that City needed to win when John Macken was right there, a striker left on the bench unused. As John Macken must have been incandescent with rage and wanted to tear Stuart Pearce limb from limb, City won an unlikely penalty when Rob Styles adjudged Frank Quedru to have handled the ball. In a last-minute battle of wits, whoever won out between Schwarzer and Robbie Fowler from 12 yards would win a place in Europe. Schwarzer saved Borough's European dream wouldn't be a one-season wonder, and 24 hours later, the following season began in anger. The ink had barely dried on the Premier League season when more ink was needed to sign the contracts for new players being fired through the front door of the Riverside Stadium. The aim was for 3 or 4 new faces, the first of which was a long-term target in Yakubu, as Joseph Desiree Job was loaned out to Saudi Arabia. Yakubu was an especially dangerous frontman who had stung Borough in the past, scoring 4 goals against them in an earlier fixture. He was about to enter his peak and would complement the trio of Hasselbank, Viduka and the returning Macaroni perfectly. Elsewhere, Emmanuel Pogatetz and Fabio Rochenbach provided competition for the first team that thickened the squad out a touch. That was rendered much needed, especially after Bolo Zenden left for Liverpool, the European champions, at the end of his contract. Not many could blame him. Michael Reisiger was another Barcelona alum leaving the northeast, but he was also quickly replaced, even if Abel Xavier wouldn't feature long before a positive drug test ruled him out for the remainder of the season. The season was birthed with a valuable point at home to Liverpool before an ineffectual Borough were beaten down at White Hart Lane. Inconsistencies would plague McLaren's team in the league throughout the season. They'd lose against the likes of the struggling Charlton and Sunderland as well as the newly promoted West Ham, but pinch 3 points against title challengers Arsenal and Manchester United. After a 2-month winless streak in the league that stretched into the new year, it quickly became apparent that this season was all about the European run. By the time Aston Villa ran rampant at Riverside, scoring 4 without reply in January, the mood was low. A fan had ripped up a season ticket on the pitch in front of Steve McLaren, Mark Schwarzer had put in a transfer request, injuries were crippling the defence as per usual, and the club was busy flirting with relegation, not the European places as they had designed. A further defeat to Wigan Athletic later that month prompted the spark for what had hitherto been a flagging campaign. Gareth Southgate called a team meeting to clear the air. It must have worked, as Borough won 6 of their next 9 to pull clear of the drop, which included a monumental 3-0 win over a Jose Mourinho Chelsea team that barely ever lost. Borough were now allowed to focus on cup competitions, all the while Steve Gibson never really felt it necessary to sack McLaren. After all, they had comfortably sealed progression to a successive UEFA Cup knockout phase. Greek opposition squad Xanthi were no match in the first round before a kind group stage was gift-wrapped to Borough. Over the coming months, Grasshoppers Zurich, AZ Alkmaar Dnipro and Litex Lovech were the opponents on the continent. Each of Hasselbank, Yakubu and Viduka got Borough's campaign on the road, with goals in the victories over Grasshoppers and Dnipro before the toughest test of the lot, AZ away from home. Borough kept a clean sheet for the 5th European match in a row, before Macaroni completed the set of attackers to find the net in the groups, sinking Litex Lovech for a near-perfect group phase and top spot. They ought to have been further rewarded with a kinder last 32 tie, but they ultimately got fed a path of Stuttgart and potential ties against Roma and Basel, i.e. Champions League level opposition. It wasn't just the European dream alive though. Whilst Borough's Christmas was ruined by a League Cup quarter-final exit at the hands of Blackburn, they kept trucking in the FA Cup, despite replays against lower league Nuneaton and Coventry. Preston were dispatched with a quick-fire double in the 5th round 4 days before Borough's UEFA Cup fate was decided in a return leg at home against Stuttgart. Thankfully, the European crowds had returned to the Riverside once the bigger away teams did. Borough had already grabbed a 2-1 win in Germany, so needed to limit their opposition to a 1-goal defeat back home, and just about did so despite enormous pressure. Next were arguably Borough's biggest test so far in European competition, Roma. The Italians were well on their way to becoming a big deal on the continent once again under Luciano Spalletti, and would finish second after the mess of Calciopoli before recording 2 quarter-final finishes in the Champions League. First though, they were here to win, fielding their best team with the exception of an injured Francesco Totti. Even so, Yakubu slotted home an early penalty in front of the Riverside faithful before an excruciating match played out. Unlike in the last 16, they would have to go to Italy and get a result. And in Rome, despite hitting the woodwork early on, Borough rode the storm and waltzed into a 2-0 aggregate lead via a Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank header. The opposition grabbed goals either side of the break, but it was too little, too late, as Borough snuck through on away goals yet again. And this bit isn't even the exciting bit in Borough's European story. After more heroics in Rome, Schwarzer had finally won the fans back after rescinding his transfer request. He was unable to stop a patchwork Borough from conceding twice though, as they were downed in Switzerland at the hands of Basel in the quarter-finals. Missing Southgate through injury as well as George Boateng and Lee Cattermole through suspension, Emmanuel Pogatetz furthered the pain by suffering a broken nose and fractured cheekbone that ruled him out for the remainder of the season. Ahead of the second leg, McLaren called for unity in his programme notes and was aided by Southgate's return, but it was Basel breaking the deadlock at the Riverside. There was an air of Borough having nothing left to lose, and that is where the meat of our story starts. Mark Viduka powered in an equaliser to give hope before the break, and found a second shortly before the hour mark. Then the fuse was lit by a Basel red card, and Hasselbank immediately decided to rasp one in from distance to equalise the aggregate scores. There now remained 11 minutes left to get the vital fourth goal, or they were going to be the victims of an away goals defeat. Then Alastair Brownlee echoed his immortal line on the radio waves, which we've pinched for the title of this video, as Massimo Macaroni squeezed a stoppage time winner in. Borough had effectively come from 3 down to win, and this was only the quarter-final. Between rounds, Borough had another semi-final ticket to punch, as they needed another replay to see off Charlton Athletic in the FA Cup. 8 days later, Borough began a week which could make themselves immortal. April 20th, Borough were due in Romania, whatever the weather, as Steaua Bucharest are dispatched of city rivals Dynamo. They were found wanting as Nikolai Dika funded the only goal into the top corner. Despite the loss, it was a useful result for the Borough, even if they could have done with that away goal. 3 days later, Borough were posted back to England and Villa Park for the FA Cup semi-final against West Ham, having nicely avoided Chelsea and Liverpool in the draw. This match came 7 days removed from a Premier League encounter between the two, where McLaren's team had comfortably won. A spanner, however, was bizarrely thrown into the works by Gareth Southgate of all people, whose scathing interview drew national attention ahead of the game. It told of his strained relationship with McLaren. Despite this, he started the game, but West Ham were the ones victorious late on through Marlon Harewood, and they would push Liverpool all the way in the final, not Borough. With the mountainous terrain of Europe, this might well have been the true semi-final to win. 4 days later, Borough didn't have long to wait to find out if this was the case when Steaua Bucharest travelled to the Riverside. 20 years prior, the clubs couldn't have been in more different places. Steaua were the reigning European champions, Borough almost became non-existent. Mark Schwarzer was missing through a fractured cheekbone, and his replacement Brad Jones was culpable for Steaua's 2 goals. Essentially, Borough were in the same position as the quarter-final, 3 goals down, needing 4 to progress in front of their own fans at the Riverside. This time though, it was for a place in the final. Throwing caution to the wind, Massimo Macaroni G'd up the crowd when subbed on for a half-fit Southgate in the first half. His goal on 33 minutes, almost exactly the same time that the quarter-final hope was found, kick-started the game. Viduka's header grabbed a second after the hour, before Chris Riggott bundled in the third 10 minutes later. One more was needed, as time ebbed away. And it was Macaroni, who else, to leap like an absolute salmon on the back post to meet a Stuart Downing cross, with a stoppage time winner again. As Brownlee put it on the radio, it was a stake to the Dracula boys' hearts. In 2 weeks' time, the Borough were due in Rotterdam. They prepared by fielding a barely recognisable team 3 days before the final against Sevilla. It featured 15 players from the academy in the matchday squad. Whilst it was a superb sign of a burgeoning academy, it freshened up the team ahead of the club's biggest ever game. Steve McLaren took charge of his 250th and final game as the England job came calling. Whilst he was able to recall Southgate, Hasselbank and Viduka, they weren't at peak fitness, and whilst Fabio Rochenbach had an effort whistled by close, it was Sevilla's danger man who broke the deadlock, Luis Fabiano netting midway through the first half. As the game went on, it was clear that this was backs against the wall stuff yet again for the Borough. Viduka had a penalty appeal turned down, and as Borough got desperate, the bodies flooded forward as they had done against Basel and against Stour. One goal, then another, and then a third in quick succession. Only these were scored by the Spaniards as they capitalised on the counter. Finally, on game 64 of a long old season, it was over. Unfortunately for Middlesbrough to do well, they usually have to be better than the sum of their parts. The team Steve McClaren created between 2001 and 2006 was exactly that. Over time, its success might get lost or overshadowed by the lustre of Juninho and Fabrizio Ravanelli and the mid-90s team of Brian Robson. But this was a team that had seen the error of those ways, backed by a chairman who still held the same ambition, that craved the success, and they wanted to do it in any way possible. As the stadium and the facilities sprouted up in Middlesbrough in the 1990s, the 2000s was the time to capitalise on this. Gibson, a young chairman, got himself a young and prosperous coach in the same mould to be able to finally call Middlesbrough a winner in this game we call football. The result was a more mature and more professional club in pretty much every aspect. Therefore, they went further than ever before. Gibson had clearly learned his lessons from the heady days of '97. McClaren was a modern-day coach who embraced analysts and psychologists and, crucially, knew the value of the youth academy. He lent on the cornerstones of Mark Schwarzer, Gareth Southgate, Gaizka Mendieta and Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank on the pitch. But Offit relied on the likes of Bill Bezic, his right-hand man, Steve Round, who aided the development of young players in the senior team, and David Parnaby, who ran the academy to perfection. With all this combined and a little bit of luck and incredible amounts of comeback stories along the way, from Basel and Stour to the little fella and Massimo Macaroni, Middlesbrough were able to go further than they had ever done. Unfortunately, it was never as sustained as it could have been. Steve McClaren was long touted for the England job once Sven-Goran Eriksson had announced his resignation in January 2006 for after that summer's World Cup. Once Luis Felipe Scolari rejected the FA's advances, the England assistant and Middlesbrough manager was the front runner. In McClaren's own words, "You can't turn down the England job." And he didn't, and it went drastically wrong, just as it did for Middlesbrough. All it took was three things. 1. The aging of an experienced squad, with a significant portion of them coming to the end of their careers at the same time, with little to no resale value. 2. One wrong managerial decision, and 3. The rise of the Premier League's television revenues. Placing a squad build on a coach or manager with vast experience might not have been a problem. However, when Martin O'Neill and Otmar Hitzfeld were sounded out for the managerial role, neither materialised, and Steve Gibson handed control to former player Gareth Southgate. As such, it was always an uphill task. Southgate's UEFA Pro licence had to be fast-tracked for his managerial spell to begin in time for the 2006-07 season. It wasn't that Steve Gibson had lost his ambition, that Middlesbrough had suffered relegation in 2009. It was because that his perpetual investment into the club had been nullified by the raging beast that was the Premier League. With the closed shop of the Big Four of Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool and Manchester United doing the business in Europe, money was pumped into the Premier League's television bidding wars. The winners were most clubs and the television channels. The losers were clubs such as Middlesbrough, who had previously been a rare species in the league. Backed by a committed owner and, most importantly, a supporter, the club could rely on consistent investment from above, something that clubs of their ilk couldn't always rely upon. Consequently, you now see Middlesbrough treading water in the second tier of English football, as they have done for all but one of the 15 seasons since.